Before we dive into the topics which we're going to cover in this lesson, I want to take a quick moment to talk about the big picture goal for this section. The goal is to allow users to be able to fetch a forecast for their location from the weather website. So instead of someone running a command from the terminal to get the forecast, they'll be able to pull up a URL in the browser. Here they'll see a form. They type their address into an input, they click a button, and a few hundred milliseconds later, their weather information shows up. This is going to provide a much nicer interface for interacting with our Node application. They'll be able to do so via the browser, as opposed to doing so by running commands from the terminal. Getting all of this done is going to require us to actually fill out that one route we created earlier in the class. That was /weather. When we originally created it, we just had it send back some static JSON. We created an object with some dummy data inside. The goal in this section is to have the code inside of here actually use the geocode and forecast functions we created earlier. It's then going to send that JSON data back to the browser, and the browser will be able to render the forecast correctly. Let's go ahead and kick things off in this video by talking about how the browser is going to be able to send the address to this route, because think about it. The weather route needs to know what address it should geocode and fetch the forecast for. To get that done, we'll use a query string. So the browser is going to provide a query string as part of the URL. The server will then read the query string value to get the address information. To kick things off, I'm going to close all open files except for app.js. That's the only file we're going to need inside of the web server folder, and I am going to collapse the public and templates directory just to stay a bit organized. Now, you've already worked with query strings before. You'll remember that we used them with the geocoding API. Over in weather app, we had the utils directory. In there, we had geocode.js. Inside of this file, when we created the URL, we used a query string to provide the access token, and then we provided that value. And I also used it to set up one of the options we explored, which was limiting us to just the single first result. We're going to go ahead and also use a query string with the endpoint we're going to create to accept the address. To get started, let's go ahead and create a second URL that sends back JSON. We're going to use that to experiment with query strings and Express. Then you'll use what you've learned as the challenge to integrate that into /weather up above. So down here, app.get, let's set up a URL like /products. Let's say we're creating an endpoint that sends back products to be displayed in the browser on our e-commerce site. Now, right here, we still get request and we still get response. And for the moment, we're just going to send back some JSON using response.send. I'm going to send back a static object, and the only property we're going to have on here is products, and we'll set it equal to an empty array, sending back no products. Now I'm going to save app.js, and we're going to crack that URL open in the browser. I'm going to leave the web app open in a separate tab. I'll visit localhost 3000 /products. Now, when we visit this, we are going to get our static JSON showing up, and this is never going to change. If we wanted to actually implement some sort of search feature, we would use a query string. And remember, query strings get provided on the end of the URL. We start them off with a question mark, then we provide key value pairs to pass additional information to the server. So in this case, the format is key equals value. For an e-commerce site, I might want users to be able to search amongst the list of products for a specific one. And for that, I could set up a search query argument, search equals, and let's say the person is searching for games. So I would put their search term right inside of here. Now, if I hit enter, this is going to fire off another request to our Express server, but it's going to pass along this additional information. Now, since we're the ones creating the back end, we can choose to support as many or as few query string options as we'd like. We could support 0, 1, or 30. In this case, we're passing just one along. If we did want to provide a second or a third, we would just separate them using the ampersand. That is Shift 7 on your keyboard, followed by another key value pair. Maybe I want to set up support for something like rating, which allows me to search for products that have a specific rating. Let's say I want to only see 5-star products, so the best games possible. If I send this off, now we're passing 2 pieces of information along to the server, and the question is, how does the server actually get that information? Now, this information, it's available to us inside of our express route handler. That's our function right here. We have both request and response, and we've used response plenty of times before. Information about that query string, though, that lives on request. Let's go ahead and explore that down below. The request object has a query property on there. Query is also an object, and this contains all of the query string information. Before we go any further, let's just dump this to the console to see what exactly we get. So right here, console.log, I'm then going to dump request.query to the console. I'll save app.js so the server restarts, and all we're going to do is refresh our current page in the browser. Now, the response is still exactly the same, but if I head back over to Visual Studio Code down below, I can see I'm getting an object printing. I have a search property with the value games, and I have a rating property with the value of 5. So the query string that was provided along with the request has been parsed by Express, and the data is made available to us in this object. If I wanted to grab the string value for search, I could use request.query.search. Now I'm grabbing one of the individual values, and if I refreshed the browser once again, we would be able to see that string print inside of the terminal. So being able to work with request.query is how we're going to access those additional values passed along with the request. Now, Express doesn't give us a way to force a given query option to be provided. So for this example, let's say that search needs to be provided. You have to search for something, but you don't have to provide rating. If we wanted to actually set that up, we'd have to use an if statement to add a little bit of conditional logic inside of our function. Let's go ahead and do just that, making sure that search is actually there before we send back the products. Right here, to do that, we will use an if statement. I'm going to set up an if statement, and the goal is to run this if statement only when something has gone wrong, when there is no search term. So right here, let's start by accessing the search request.query.search. That is exactly what we just used down below. Now, this is only going to run the code block when search is provided. We want the opposite effect. So to flip that, we will use the logical not operator to flip true to false or false to true. Now, this code is only going to run when there is no search term, and that is the intended result. Right here, what are we going to do? I'm going to use response.send to send back some JSON. Right here, I'm going to provide the object, and I'll set up an error message, providing them with a little feedback. I can say, you must provide a search term. Perfect. Now, if we don't provide search, we're going to see our error message showing up, and if we do, we'll see the products array coming back. Now, there's a problem with this code. I'm about to intentionally generate an error message because it's an error that comes up in the Q&A very often, and I want to make sure that students actually know what's going on. So I'm going to save app.js, making sure NodeMon restarts. Over in the browser, what we're going to do is get rid of search. We can actually get rid of the entire query string just heading over to /products. I'm going to do just that. And what do we get? We get our message showing up correctly. Error, you must provide a search term. In the terminal, though, you can see we did indeed get a JavaScript error printing. And if I scroll up to the top of it, it says the following: cannot set headers after they are sent to the client. You're going to see this error message when you try to respond to a request twice. You can't do that. HTTP requests have a single request that goes to the server and a single response that comes back. In this case, we are indeed trying to respond twice. If there is no search term, we use response.send to send back the error, but then the code down below, it still runs. We can see undefined was printed because there was no search field provided. That's coming from this line right here. Then we use response.send again to try to send back the other object. This is what's causing the error. So if you ever see cannot set headers after they are sent to the client, that means you are sending two responses back when you can only send one. To address this with our current setup, all we need to do is add return right here before response.send. By using return, we are stopping the function execution, that is this function right here. So if there is no search term, we stop the function and send back the response, which means the code down below doesn't run. Now you could have also just added on else and put the success case code right inside of here, but this is a pretty common pattern with Express, so I wanted to make you aware of it. So when you write Express code and look at other code people have written, code like this actually makes sense to you. So now we have enforced that the search term is provided. I'm going to save app.js and scroll to the bottom. I can see that my server did restart, there are no errors, and if I refresh things in the browser, we still get our error message, but this time over in the terminal, nothing has gone wrong since we only tried to respond a single time. Now let's add on search and make sure that still works. Right here, question mark, search equals games, and I'll leave off rating since that shouldn't be required. And right here, we are now getting our success content showing up. Down below, we have our little products JSON available. So that is it for the basics of query strings. The client, whether it's us typing a URL in the browser or us providing a URL via client-side JavaScript, can set up that query string. It gets sent off to the server. The server can use that information with the request, and it can send a response back. Now, currently, we aren't using the search term to do anything meaningful, but down below, you could imagine we had an array of products, and we used the array filter method to actually filter. That brings us to the other route we have set up, /weather. Now that we've explored how we can use the query string, it's going to be your challenge for the video to do something similar for the endpoint we're actually going to wire up with the weather application. Right here, what I'd like you to do is update the weather endpoint right here to accept an address. Now this address, which will be provided as part of the query string, that's going to be required, and it's going to be the only query option that we support. So you have to provide the address, otherwise we won't know which location to fetch the weather for. So if no address is provided, you're going to set up the route handler to send back an error message. You can send back a JSON object like we did down below, setting up an error property with a message like address must be provided. Now, if there is an address, that's great. For the moment, you're going to continue to send back the static JSON above. In the next several videos, we'll worry about actually geocoding things and getting the forecast. Then these values will no longer be static, they'll be dynamic. Now, when you do send this back, I also want you to add on an additional property, address, and the value for address should just be whatever address was passed in. So you're taking the input and you're adding it on to the response, sending it back just so that information is available. Now, step number 3. You want to go to /weather. When you do that, you should see the error saying you must provide an address. So you'll go over to /weather with the address query option set up in the query string. And when you do this, I would expect to see this object with the address property added, and the value would be Philadelphia, matching up with the value right here. You could then visit it again with a different URL to make sure you see that as you change the address. All right, take as much time as you need to knock that one out, test your work, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and kick things off in the browser by switching up our URL. I'm going to go from /products to /weather. Now in this case, I'm not providing the address, so I would expect to see my error showing up instead of seeing the dummy data. To actually get that done, we're going to continue on with step number 1. No address, send back an error message. In here, we'll use an if statement like we did down below. So if the condition and the code to run, we're going to start by accessing request.query.address. Now this is going to run the code. If there is an address, we'll flip that using the logical not operator. Now the code's only going to run when there's no address, and we're going to send back that error. I'll use return to make sure the function stops, then I'll use response.send to send back the following object. The object will have a single property error and will provide a little message. That's ERROR, perfect. The string can say something simple like you must provide an address. The exact text you chose to set up here is not important for the challenge. Anything similar would have worked. Now we have the error handling set up. If there is an address, I want to continue to send back the JSON, and that is exactly what this code is going to do. If there is no address, I now get my error. Let's go ahead and set one up though. We use the question mark, address equals, I'll use Philadelphia as mine, and right here I do indeed see that static JSON showing up. Now I wanted you to also add an additional property onto the object that contains the value provided. So right here, address is going to get its value from request.query.address, which we know exists since we already added the conditional logic up above. Now that we have this in place, I should be able to refresh the browser once again, see my additional property with my search term right inside. I'm going to swap out Philadelphia for something like Boston, and if I run that, what do I get? I'm seeing Boston show up as the value for address. Now that we have the query string in place, we are indeed headed in the right direction, and the weather endpoint is going to be easy to continue to expand on and actually use that address to geocode and fetch the forecast information. Down below, I'm going to remove those challenge comments, save the file for the final time in this one, and that's where we're going to stop for the moment. Now that we know how to get additional information along with the request, we're going to continue on in the next video, so stay tuned, and I'll see you then.